Book 56 of 2020 was Why I Write by George Orwell. So I was in Waterstones and I was looking around for some books and I saw this one on a kind of like stand of like short kind of books. And I really like George Orwell. I've read 1984 and I've read Animal Farm. Really enjoyed both of those because they're very political and I love political writing. And so I thought that this would be quite interesting to read about. It's kind of a collection of his essays. So there is Why I Write, there is The Lion and the Unicorn, there is a story about a hanging, and then there's Politics of the English Language. So essentially he's analysing various different topics, doing it very astutely as he always does, and he starts off talking about the reasons for writing, which I guess is where the title comes from, because that's the title of the first collection, the first essay in the collection that they've put together. And he says that people either write for either egoistic reasons, so, you know, satisfying their own ego, for aesthetic purposes, you know, to make a creation of art, I guess you could say, because they have enthusiasm for the topic that they're writing about, for a historical interest or for a political purpose. And he's kind of just talking about all of those different things. The one that was, or in fact, before I go on to the one that was my favourite one, because I'm going to talk about that the most, the last one was about the kind of decadent dilution of argument by the English language. So there's a kind of deconstruction of how we write in English and how that kind of is a bit flowery, and so it kind of dilutes meaning. And it's interesting actually because I used to teach at a university and I used to teach academic writing and how to be concise in writing, because a lot of people think that if they use flowery language that that's good, and it's like, no, because nobody understands what you're talking about, because you're talking metaphorically and you're being very vague and you're not kind of being particular with your points. So there's a real kind of disconnect with what's considered good writing and the appearance of good writing. You know, that sometimes people write in such a flowery way that the people reading it think that they're the stupid ones because they don't get it. And in reality, if it was good writing, it wouldn't matter who you were, you would understand it, because the purpose of somebody writing is to get across the message. And if they haven't done that and you don't understand it, then they've not done it well enough. So I thought that was very interesting that it's something that Orwell has talked about, because I've thought about that for a long time. So the one that was the most interesting one was the one called The Lion and the Unicorn, which is essentially about socialism, and Orwell's basically dissecting the political landscape of England. And there's a section in it that's really interesting because he's talking about English culture. And for anyone who thinks that England doesn't have a culture, you know, the kind of all like multicultural kind of conversations that go on and people kind of think that England doesn't have a culture, read this book because you'll see what our culture is. And as I was reading it, I was like, oh yeah, like this is very English, like this is what our culture is. So that was interesting. And he also talks about how there's a kind of hypocrisy within England to do with the empire, because whilst at home, you know, English people were very anti-militant and were very against war, they were okay with the empire, which was like war on foreign soil. So he discusses that, and he talks about how we have kind of a rule of law in England and we have a democracy, but it's an illusion because we don't actually have those things, because it's almost like a mask for totalitarian rule. We're led to believe that we have fairness and that we have justice, and yet a lot of the populace are manipulated against their own interests by the ruling elite, so that they vote for people that ultimately are against their own economic interests. So you've got a lot of people that are in working class conditions voting for ruling class parties like Conservative. It's like you're voting against your economic interests because you're being manipulated by various different things. And so therefore lots of people are suffering from economic inequalities, but they voted for it. So, you know, there we go. Blows my mind. Orwell also talks about how English nationalism, and particularly xenophobia, is stronger in the working classes. And he talks about how in the working classes, you're a lot closer. In fact, I don't know if Orwell does talk about this or if I've read this somewhere else, but as I was writing it on my board just then, I was thinking about this, and it's either come from this book or it's come from somewhere else. The reason why working class people are more likely to align with ruling class ideology is because there's so much distance between them and rich people, but they're very, very close to the people that are below them. And so it's very easy for them to be disgusted with the people that are below them that they think are not working hard and whatever, without actually looking at the people that are kind of being exploitative of systems and making money from that. You know, when you talk about rich people taking advantage of the system, they're taking like millions and billions of pounds, but yet you are more likely to care about someone who's claiming like £70 a week on benefits, which is nowhere near as much money and nowhere near as exploitative as what the rich people are doing. Like, doesn't make sense, but this is what people do, you know, rather than kind of riling against. I mean, look at now with COVID and all the kind of PPE contracts that have gone to like people without fair contests for those contracts just because they've got, you know, nepotistic kind of, I don't know if that's a word, but I've just made it up. I'm thinking of nepotism, you know, kind of giving contracts to their friends and families or people that they've got kind of shares or interests in terms of money where they'll benefit from it. And yet no one's protesting and rallying up against this because yet they're, in their mind, they're still thinking about the people that are claiming benefits. It's crazy. What Orwell says as well is that with working class people, there's a distinct lack of philosophical faculty and reason and appreciation of the arts. And so therefore, because of that, and because they're not likely to seek information outside of what is given to them, it's easier for the ruling elite to manipulate them through newspapers, because newspapers are controlled by the ruling elite. So conservatives own newspapers and portray news and censor it in such a way that it benefits their political aims, and yet working class people still fall for it and still think that it's correct what they're reading because it's in a newspaper. And so, you know, everyone is being manipulated by the ruling elite to vote against their own economic interests, and they just, you know, they don't have the kind of wider understanding of the world to recognise that that's happening. And Orwell also talks about how conservatives seem to have a distinct lack of understanding of what socialism is. And that if they actually truly understood what socialism was, then more people would vote for socialism. There seems to be a kind of lack of understanding that socialism and communism are the same thing. They're not. You know, communism is not socialism. Communism is built on socialist principles, but socialism doesn't agree with a dictator or someone who's kind of like, you know, manipulated and totalitarian. Like, that's not what socialism is. And because of this, and if you don't believe that this is the case, you only have to look at history. You know, in pre-Second World War, Britain sided with fascist regimes, so sided with Germany before they declared war. I think it was Germany and was it perhaps Italy as well, who were against someone who was socialist. I can't fully remember because I read this quite a while ago. But because they were against socialism, they sided with the ones that were against socialism, but they were fascist. And obviously it came about because, you know, they declared war against us. So how can you be so stupid? But there we are. That's, you know, conservatives for you. I'm not taking a pop at conservatives, but I'm talking about like the leaders of Conservative Party that sided with these fascist regimes just because they were against socialism. That's what's stupid. Because they ended up, you know, declaring war on us and causing lots of economic strife and all the rest of it. Orwell, interestingly, so, you know, Orwell is not biased. He's very kind of balanced in his kind of criticisms, and if there's a criticism to be had, he does it no matter what kind of side he's on or whatever, which I really respect him for, because I think that's important. Like, you know, when you are discussing things, you need to also critique the side that you're on, because there's obviously problems with it, which is why it's not successful. And so he critiques the leftist intelligentsia because they have a lack of practicality. The leftist intelligentsia are very kind of like pacifist is what I was trying to say, in their approach, because they're very anti-war. So obviously Orwell's writing about the time when world wars were happening. And, you know, if a country declares war on you, well, you know, we need to fight back, otherwise you're going to get invaded and taken advantage of and exploited and all the rest of it. So in that situation, you can't stick by the principle of being anti-war because there's a threat to the country of, you know, national security. So in that situation, you're being very impractical if you stick by that anti-war kind of, you know, belief, because yes, war is a bad thing, but it's a bad thing on other people's soils. It's not a bad thing when it's on your own, when it's like compromising your own safety of your nation. Then you have a right to kind of, you know, war back, I would think. But obviously that's just my opinion, and but this is what Orwell's kind of talking about as well. And he also points out that the leftists have a lack of preparedness to be in power, because if we look at our history, they've not been in power very often. And when they do come in power, they have a lot of kind of undoing of conservative stuff before they can do what they want to do. So it ends up being that they never look very successful, because they're fighting against everything that's been the status quo for a very long time. And obviously, if you haven't got a majority in Parliament, you can't really make much difference anywhere. And it was interesting that, because at the time of me reading this book, I was watching The Crown, and it was during Attlee's years when he, I think, had just come to power after Churchill, and he did a really bad job of what the Crown was portraying. That might not have been the case, you know. I imagine that the BBC is quite conservative, but anyway, and so it kind of got me thinking about, yeah, if this is a criticism that I hear a lot from people that I know who are conservative. They kind of say, you know, would Labour do a better job than Conservative? And it's kind of like, I recognise why they might say that, but, you know, if you never give another side the chance, then how are you going to know that they would do a better job or not? Because looking at the state of the country at the minute with Conservatives, I don't know how Labour could have done any worse, to be quite frank with you, and they wouldn't have been benefiting the ruling elite, which is what is definitely happening now. You know, I literally, the recent headline that I read was that they're on about freezing public sector workers' pay for 3 years, and I'm like, are you actually kidding me? Like, you've literally just given MPs a pay rise of £3,000 a year, and you're gonna freeze public sector workers. That when we get a pay rise, so I'm a public sector worker, which is why I'm really annoyed about this. You know, I work really, really hard, and now you're telling me my pay is going to be frozen. When you kind of each year you get an increment, but it's like, you know, in your actual take-home pay packet, it's about 20 quid a month extra. It's not very much, and yet they're on about kind of freezing it. Like, we already get paid less money for the hours that we do. Like, you know, when I'm thinking about it, like the work that I've done in the past, like, week, I've probably worked about 50 hours. I don't get paid for 50 hours, you know, there's no overtime. Like, you literally just, you work because you need to do the work, but you don't get paid for it because I'm in the public sector. And then they want to freeze my pay. Great Conservative government, love you. Not. Anyway, getting into politics as always. Interestingly, Orwell talks about how the expansion of the middle class is because of socialist reforms to things like housing, welfare, education. All these things are socialist policies, and if they hadn't have been introduced, you wouldn't be middle class right now. You know, you would still be a peasant, like, because you weren't born a lord, you weren't born into money, so you would be a peasant right now if it wasn't for socialism. So anybody that wasn't born into money, why are you voting for the ruling class? Why are you voting for Conservatives? Because you're voting against your own economic interests, like you're creating social inequality. And Orwell talks about kind of capitalism, and capitalism is for private profit. It's not ethical. It's not, you know, wanting anybody to have justice and fairness. Like, it's about making the most money that they can do at the expense of other people. And obviously the moneyed people are going to be in opposition to socialism because it's against their economic interests. So obviously they're going to criticise socialism. And Orwell kind of ends by saying, you know, he wants political reform, he wants minimum wage for people, he wants education for all, he wants nationalisation of services so that we could have some control over the profits and redistribution to people. Now, I don't know about you, but why would you disagree with that? Why would you not want a minimum wage? Why would you not want education for all? Why would you not want kind of control over services so that profits can be put back into the country? Like, why would you not want that? That sounds insane to me that you would not want that, because, you know, without those things, if you were not somebody that was born into money, then you would not have anything that you have right now if it wasn't for socialism. So it's just crazy that people would vote against it. I'm reading at the minute a book called The Shock Doctrine, which I'll do a review of when I've read it. It's by Melanie Klein, I think she's called. Oh, it's here. Naomi Klein. I don't know who Melanie Klein is, but that's somebody else. But anyway, Naomi Klein. And it's talking about how every time capitalism has gone into, so free market capitalism has gone into any kind of other countries of the world, so Southern American countries, and there's quite a few different ones that were mentioned that I can't bring to mind right now because obviously I've done a review and I haven't read anything about it. I'm just reading it at the minute. And every time it's decimated, Poland, it's just come to mind, it's decimated their economy, and they've ended up being very kind of poor after it and in lots of debt. And it was better for them to be socialist. You know, they thought they were voting against kind of like totalitarian rule and whatever and dictatorship by voting for capitalism, but actually it made everything, you know, 10 times worse, and it was through the manipulation of the United States of America. So, you know, interestingly, when everyone thinks that America is an angel and doesn't do any wrong in other countries, it's done so much wrong in so many countries. Like, I'm not surprised that people don't like America, but I will do a review of that when I've read it. So I would definitely recommend, where I put it, this book, just for that discourse on the political landscape in England, because George Orwell, the reason I love him so much is because he literally writes everything that I've been thinking about, and I'm like, he literally is like my mind on paper, and so it's nice for me to have some kind of I was going to say brotherhood, but that's very patriarchal, isn't it? Some kind of like belonging with somebody because he thinks like I do, which is great because obviously I'm in the minority voting for Labour and socialism. But hopefully the more people that read this, the more socialists that we will create, because why would you not be a socialist? I wasn't born into money. I'm against the ruling elite. Please stop voting for Conservatives.